talk with our speakers last week, and so I said I didn't know how much you explained what was happening at your firms and what's your role. That was going to be my first question is, um, if you could explain what you're doing in this area of diversity and inclusion, what role, what is your firm doing? What role are you playing? And is it working? So maybe Nick, you could start.
Yeah, I'll start off. Well, I'll start off, and Professor Miller, I prefaced my earlier statements the same as you, as I've lost my filter, so I'll continue. Um, from my perspective, the term diversity is an unnecessary and, quite frankly, a worthless term now. Maybe in the 90s it was important, but I think we've moved long beyond that, and we've shifted more toward an idea of equity and inclusion. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I think both individuals as well as businesses, the University of Illinois understands that playing the numbers game doesn't do anything. So if you're running a business, if you're an HR professional and you think, well, I have a homogenous environment, so I need to bring in a couple of people who don't look like me or don't celebrate the same God that I celebrate or have the same beliefs that I do, then that's going to make me a better organization. You're wrong. None of that matters unless you're going to include them in your operation, respect their beliefs, and actually incorporate them into your business to ensure that your business is growing with them and they're growing with your business. As that relates to my firm, we had a diversity committee for a number of years, and I was a member of that diversity committee. And from my perspective, it didn't have a purpose. It didn't have a goal. And it was just in name only. So I asked off of it and I said, I'm not going to be the person that's just going to be on this committee and we're not doing anything. Then after the lynching of George Floyd in Minneapolis last year, our firm, along with a number of other businesses in the Chicagoland area, as well as in the country, started taking a harder look at what was happening in the environment and moving beyond just social justice and thinking about, okay, what is our role here? And from my perspective, it's always going to start with economic justice, because I think it's easy for those of us to sit in 2020, 2021 and say, well, if we look back at, the hallmarks of the civil rights leaders, such as Martin Luther King and John Lewis, well, their goal was certain rights for individuals. But it was social. It's like, no, that's what is now 40 years later has been the takeaway from that. The reality is it was always going to be a social and economic discussion. But when that economic discussion started arising, that's when the broader forces started shutting down. I mean, even in April 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was in Memphis specifically to protest against economic injustices with sanitation workers. To my point, what we did is we reinstituted at my firm our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And this time the focus was specifically on economic justice, specifically focusing on hiring young minority lawyers, for which we had not done a good job bringing in young lawyers into our firm, to make a specific targeted push at that by instituting a third year, 3L, those are third year law students, internship program for minority students. They're kicking that off in the fall. We had a run up of about 6 months to put the plan together to make sure that it's going to be effective. And so the goal is to bring minority law students into the fold at the early stages, to make a targeted push to say, you know what, we're obviously failing in this place. To JT's point, identify what the problem is and advance it from there. Secondly, we're looking at doing additional marketing toward businesses, targeting, say, look, we want to assist and focus on what business we can bring in to benefit our existing minority lawyers, our existing women lawyers, to know how we can grow their pots of business at the top while still working with growing the foundation of the firm at the lower levels.
And JT?
Yes. Nick, thanks for sharing that. I will say that I'm at Dinsmore and we are employing a hybrid approach, both internal as well as external. My role and the committees on which I currently sit on the firm's finance committee, and I also sit on the firm's attorney retention, recruitment and retention committee. Two different roles, right? So the finance committee looks more so at the operation and the monetary aspects of the firm. And to Nick's point, when you start talking about the economics, that is a very important conversation to have when you talk about the ability of a marginalized community to sustain, to make real advances. And so in looking at the operation of the firm from a financial perspective, to elevate and raise for considerations the voice of that equity piece. People frequently talk about equality. Equality is not the same as equity, right? Equity is taking into account contextual realities. Equality is just a blank slate saying, here we are going to start, here you go, right? If we're going out to dinner, everyone's going to have steak dinner. But equity says and takes into consideration those who don't eat red meat, right? It's equitable. I want to make sure those who are at the table who may not eat steak actually have something to eat as well. And so from an economic perspective, looking at from an equitable considerations, how can we ensure that we're packaging business development teams that are very diverse, that are inclusive, and that are equitable? Dinsmore participates in the Mansfield Rule. Mansfield Rule is a program, it's an initiative that looks to say, have you considered affirmatively considered 30% of women, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+, those who might have some physical or cognitive disabilities? Have you considered those who have historically been marginalized at least 30% in your opportunities for leadership, in your opportunities for client and business development, so on and so forth? And so it's a very intentional look that way. We talked about the importance of taking inventory. In 2019, Dinsmore created a Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer position. That individual not only ensures that Dinsmore is aligned with our partners, our client partners, on their diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, but also looks at the firm internally and says, are we an inclusive environment? Because as we look to recruit diverse talent, as we look to, from whether it be through the pipeline, like Nick mentioned, entry-level law students through our summers program, also as it relates to lateral associates and partners, it's important that you know and create a more inclusive environment. Because if you don't, to Nick's point, if you just say diversity, I want to grab some people who may not look like, may not have a lifestyle that's similar to mine, and I'm going to bring them in. What we realize is for the past 30 years or so, the focus on diversity has been an assimilation model. Well, what do I mean by an assimilation model? You're welcome to be part of the inner group so long as you sacrifice your uniqueness. So the more you look like the mainstream, the more accepted you are into this inner circle. And so the cost of admission is your uniqueness. Well, that doesn't make an environment or a workplace more diverse. It actually makes it more homogenous in ideology and in practice. And so what you want to do in order to be more inclusive, you want to create a space that allows the individual to be a part and yet preserve their identity. That's what it means to be inclusive. And so Dinsmore has a number of processes in which we do that, both internally, where we go through it. We're having we call them uncomfortable conversations about race. We have dispatched and employed each local office to take an approach that is unique to their own environment. We have certain, and communities to which we serve, we have certain offices that are conducting reading programs. We have certain offices that have created a workspace, a school academic hub for underprivileged children in the community, where they provide internet access and computer services, and then tutoring as well, where attorneys within the firm actually volunteer to serve as tutors for the children. We have initiatives where we're partnering, providing pro bono services to small minority owned and operated businesses, helping them. So to Nick's point about the economic investment, actually providing legal services, not just providing representation for those who may have been arrested during the civil unrest or during the protests in the summer of last year, but also providing services to businesses who may have historically had an absence or a diminished access to those resources, including some funding as well, partnering some of our clients and business partners with those minority businesses to ensure they have the funding to go about their business and get their operations off the ground. And so it's a hybrid approach that we're taking. Me personally, in Chicago, I lead the labor and employment practice team in Chicago, and being very intentional about creating an inclusive environment. I manage full-time a team of about 4 or 5 lawyers. Each of them are diverse in some way. And I also work with lawyers in about 10 of the firm's offices, a very inclusive team. I lead probably one of the most inclusive teams within the firm, definitely the most inclusive team within the labor department. And that's intentional. And so it's being very cognizant of looking for individuals and building a team that is inclusive, where people from various walks of life and lifestyles feel like they can be a part of something greater.
Oh, okay. Because I'm wondering, when I was doing some research on this, it's talking about, one, I would like maybe to have you guys both talk about what is the HR role in your firm and what you just talked about. How are you interacting with that? What are HR people do? And then I heard this comment, and I think, JT, you may have addressed this thing about inclusion, but it said too many HR people are focusing on diversity and not enough on inclusion part. And then the question is, what can HR professionals do to make that happen, to get that inclusion within a firm? So JT, I'll let you start.
Sure, I'll hop in on this, and I'll say a word so that everyone has a takeaway from it. Intentionality, right? It takes intentionality. It takes conscious thought. What do I mean by that? Let's talk about algorithms, because we understand that data, big data, has become, it's the age of data, and we understand that it's here, and algorithms run and operate much of what we do. We are a society that's really looking towards automation, but it's important to understand how algorithms work. Algorithms work one of 2 ways. Either you program it to perform a specific task. So I want to select all candidates that are from UIC, right? That's what it's going to do. It's going to get all UIC candidates. That's what you designed a program to do. That's what it's going to do. But algorithms also work where they predict outcomes. And many of us think, well, if it predicts outcomes, then that's good, right? We can just put it on autopilot and run with that. But how does the algorithm learn in order to predict the outcomes? It learns based upon historical data. So it's actually information that is inputted into the program, which then the program learns and begins to predict. So we know this country has had a history of disenfranchising Black and brown peoples. So if you upload all of the resumes and all of the applications that you've had over the past 20 years, well, the algorithm begins to pick up on the fact that you haven't hired a significant number of racially ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+, you name it, right? And so the algorithm then begins to predict and begins to send you only candidates that would fit within the realm of those you have historically hired. So if you operate according to that model, you're going to keep getting what you got before. And so it's important to reassess how you do things. I was on a call yesterday with the general counsel of Microsoft, Dev Stalkoff, and she talked about the purpose and intentionality of thinking outside of the box, which is very difficult for lawyers to do. Let me just tell you, I've known Nick for a long time. I've known Nick since about 99, since about 97, I want to say, that I've known Nick. And I can tell you that lawyers typically are very rote in their thinking in many respects, in their practices, right? It's a very interesting dichotomy, that we are at the forefront of innovation, but yet the last thing and adopted and incorporated. But the reason why I raise that is because Dev said, and Microsoft, they had to rethink how they assessed pools and resources of talent. They had to get away from the Ivy League schools, have all the talent, and they had to start to think intentionally about recruiting at HBCUs, at UIC, at other institutions. If you want to change what you're getting, you have to be willing to change what you're doing.
Okay. And then Nick,
I think what JT said is absolutely correct. The HR function is to look outside of the four corners. In most HR departments that I've worked with as outside counsel, they're typically provided a framework of of people who they want to recruit, and then they conduct an initial scan of resumes, possibly even an initial interview. They have a lot more freedom than I think many of them realize. And that freedom is exactly to JT's point, is to look beyond the realm. I doubt if the head of a particular department came to HR and would say, I only want you to provide me the heterosexual white male Christian candidate from name your university. They probably said, I need candidates to join my team and I need solid people. Well, at that point, I think the onus is on HR to look deeper and say, you know what? It seems that every resume that we're getting fits this model of the white male Christian candidate from a particular school. Let's go outside of that. There's nothing wrong with selecting the white male. There's nothing wrong with selecting the Christian. But if we've got a group of people who we are intentionally missing out on, and notice I said intentionally because it is an intentional factor that we are missing out on these people, we need to take additional steps. So that's on the input. The output, I think, is also during the actual interviewing of those individuals. JT and I came up during a time, I hate to think that we're that much older than maybe some of the people on this call, but we came up during a time that if you walked into an interview with facial hair the way that he and I have, it was an automatic rejection. Me, on the other hand, I was so happy to grow a beard when I was, 17 years old. I've had one ever since. It's like, if I miss out on that job, there will be another one. It's not that I thought I was being a rebel. It was just, I was so excited to grow facial hair at a young age. But I think that HR function, the fact that was beaten into us at an early age, that is also with those same HR professionals to say, we need someone who looks a certain way, who acts a certain way. That means when you're interviewing these people, you need to look beyond how their hair looks, because that's a real issue when you have people who are discriminated against, particularly women, particularly Black women, who are discriminated against based on their hair. Then you have people from various cultures who are discriminated against based upon their dress. You have people who are discriminated against based upon how they may look. And I think it's important that when you're involved in this process, that you're looking at these people. Right? Nobody's asking you to throw a bone. What we're talking about is to open your eyes to other issues. Open your eyes, because that is what will create a more inclusive environment. More importantly, it's like, I'm sure there's someone on this call wondering, why do I care? I've got a team full of solid people. I don't particularly care where they're from or what their background is. Well, you should care, because as the country gets more and more diverse, as this Gen Z group takes hold, as millennials take a further hold in management structures, as well as in partnering with your businesses, you're going to see that you're missing out on strong talent. You're going to see you're missing out on those collaborative efforts. You're going to see that by missing out on that, you are now harming yourself in the marketplace. And that's the key. Is there going to be a one-to-one causal effect to say, well, if I hire this individual or this group of individuals, then that's going to increase my bottom line by X%? Probably not. However, what you can guarantee is, to JT's point, is either evolve or die. I mean, when both of us were at UIC, UIC was considered one of the most diverse campuses in the state. And I know it still is. However, the problem was, even though it sits in the west side of Chicago, it has a population that is 8% Black. 25 years later, that has not changed. So you've got to start asking yourself the question, why? Why? Whether it's at the University of Illinois at Chicago, an institution that I absolutely love, or if it's at a mom and pop company of 4 or 5 employees. What is it about the institution that we have been unable to shift that paradigm? What is it about the institution that we've been unable to change the thought processes of how we are bringing folks in, including them in the process, and allowing them to flourish? That's an HR function. That's your job.
Let me piggyback on that. I just want to add an addendum to what was stated earlier and what Nick just capitalized and elevated for our consideration. When you look at the HR function, and Nick mentioned the output, so let's talk about that output for a moment. Show me a business or a workplace that does not have an employee handbook or some form of policy, right? There are policies that are in place. When you talk about the output, so you've been intentional, you've made sure you brought in a diverse group to be considered, and you hire some individuals that are different from those who are already there. Fantastic, great job. Question: are these policies actually effective? Well, back up. Are they actually implemented? And if they're implemented, are they actually effective? What we understand is that people don't typically operate according to policy. And this ties back to what Nick said when we first opened this conversation and this discussion. Attitude reflects leadership, right? Where is your leadership on this? How your line staff follows, operates, and moves is going to be directly impacted by what's modeled by your leadership. More is caught than is taught. Your policy can say one thing, but if your management, your leadership conducts themselves a different way, it's not going to matter what your policy says, right? So it's the HR function to say, where's our leadership in this space? Are our policies aligned with the vision of the leadership? Are we implementing those policies? So are we creating an inclusive environment, right? So that's one aspect of it, of the HR function. Why is it important to have individuals from differing perspectives, from differing backgrounds? Because those different people have different experiences and different perspectives. If everyone has the same experience, has the same perspective, then what you find yourself in an echo chamber. I say I, everyone says I, right? There's no challenge. There's no, hey, well, how about this? Or how about that? It creates an environment that is actually stifled. So you think you're increasing in competitiveness by getting everyone who looks the same, sounds the same, but actually you're diminishing because you are losing unique perspective that will allow you to provide a more thorough analysis. I try cases all the time, as does Nick. I can tell you how many times you go into courtrooms and people have their equation all written out and the jury throws it out the window, right? And the jury throws it out the window because of what they presented did not take hold. There was a perspective, there was an angle, there was something that was not contemplated. And it's important that you minimize the likelihood of that happening when you have more eyes looking at an issue. If I held up, I'm going to use my lip balm for a moment. If I hold this up from the screen and I ask what people see, if everyone's facing camera facing, they're going to tell me, well, I see Vaseline. This is not a plug for Vaseline. They're going to say, I see Vaseline is contained, right? But what if I have someone looking from the top? Well, they see a blue top. What if I have someone looking from the back? I see an opaque container with some type of substance inside. What if they're looking from the bottom? When you have people from different perspectives, they see and have different vantage points. The more of those you have, the more periscopic a view you have of any issue. If everyone's looking at it from the same direction, they see the same thing, but you lose everything else that's blind to you. When you have a more inclusive environment, you benefit from those other vantage points, from those other perspectives. So you are able to provide more thorough analysis.
So in some of my, well, thank you for that. For some of the research I saw that there was a term called diversity fatigue. And they said that it stated that the 41% of managers say that I'm too busy to work on D&I. So, and then, it's also about, let's say you have this HR person that has your perspective there of this advantage of having an inclusive and diverse thing, but they can't just make the numbers. I mean, they do this recruiting, but they, at the end of the day, okay, we still have this percentage of minorities. We can't change it. I know we talked a little about this last week, is how do you go about doing that? Nick, maybe you can address that.
Yeah, and I think to start off with, there's a reason there. And I think there needs to be an inward facing issue as to what is the reason why you have a homogenous environment. What is the reason why that despite your purported best efforts, your environment has not changed? And I would start by saying, do you want it to change? I would next ask the question, is it a priority for those who have power? Is it a priority for those who are in the managerial space? I think the diversity fatigue angle would come if you have, for example, an HR manager who's been provided a directive but hasn't been provided a budget, has been provided a directive but hasn't been provided direction, has been provided a directive, but he or she knows that the higher ups really don't care. And I think that's where it starts. I was just reading an article today, so Harvard Business Review article regarding exactly this point, the business sense of diversity. And it was referring back to this discussion of why senior leadership has to take a significant role in caring. And they referred to a news report that came out sometime last year. And there was a Black flight attendant. I don't know what airline she worked for, but she was on an airplane. She was working, and she saw an older white individual who was reading a book regarding anti-diversity, or anti-racism, reading a book about diversity, how to create a more diverse work environment. I think specifically it was, how does a non-minority deal with these issues? And this woman used this opportunity to engage in, according to the HBR article, an engaging conversation with this individual. Come to find out, the individual she was talking to was the CEO of an airline. So, and presumably it's the same airline she worked for, but the article didn't say that. But what's interesting there is it highlights a number of factors. Factor one, that this person, this CEO, was willing to realize his frailties and said, I'm going to open it up. I'm actually going to figure this out. I'm going to pick up a book because I haven't been able to figure this out on my own. It shows number one. Number two, it also shows that this individual has not surrounded himself with a diverse and inclusive environment if he hasn't been able to figure that out until last year, until 2020. And I think number three is it highlights that there may be fatigue, but there's still ignorance. And I don't mean ignorance as a bad thing. I mean ignorance as unknowing. So we have to fight through that. There's a lot of issues that we all have our biases about. Everyone would love to be, I'm making this broad statement, so obviously I'm biased. Most people are more comfortable in environments that are like their own because they don't have to shift their thought process. They don't have to shift their personality. They don't have to wonder what they're thinking. They don't have to wonder what words are going to come out of their mouth or who they're going to insult. I could be in a room with JT and I could do or say something and I'm not worried about him judging me. And if he does judge me, it'll be okay because we'll still be cool tomorrow. But I necessarily won't have that same familiarity with someone else because I'm wondering, well, if I ask him this question, are they going to look at me like I'm a bigot? So if I have my Muslim friends and I ask them this question about Ramadan, am I going to be the fool? If I have my LGBT colleague and I ask them a question about whatever, am I going to be looked at as being someone who's not embracive of their culture or their beliefs or their religion or their whatever? We've got to move past that. So obviously there is a diversity fatigue. There's a racial fatigue. There's a pandemic fatigue. But we are in a time in 2021 that we all have to push beyond that, because the same way that there may be groups of people saying, oh man, I am so tired of people talking about race. Well, it's not going to change. It's not going to change because these issues are here to stay until you have real conversations that can be dealt with at real levels. I'm going to take it back. I'm a student of history, even though I was a political science major, student of history. You take it back to the Civil War. And after the Civil War, you're talking about Reconstruction. And that was the time of amazing flourishment for like 2 years for Black folks in this country, until I'm going to take the term that Van Jones used in 2016, until the white lash came. And now after that, then you had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. You had the rise of the Black Codes. You had the rise of President Andrew Johnson and his beliefs and his thought process. Ultimately Reconstruction lasted a period of about 12 to 15 years before it shut down. So during this 12-year period, you had some of the greatest political advancements of Black folks that this country saw in the years following the Civil War. And then from that moment, after Reconstruction, it shrank for like 80 years until the Civil Rights Movement. Then the Civil Rights Movement, you had a few years, and then it shrank until the 90s. So to your point, is there fatigue? Absolutely. But we're all soldiers in this fight. We've got to be, because if we think that the idea of this democracy, as flawed as it is here for good, is going to be here forever, we're wrong. This country is changing and we need to follow along with it. We need to embrace each other's cultures. We need to embrace each other's ignorances. We need to learn more about each other and continue to push through that fatigue, because we're all tired.
Yeah, I'm going to hop in here. Nick made some very key points, and I don't want to cover the same ground that he did. So I'm going to shift just a little bit. When you talk about fatigue, particularly diversity fatigue, Nick talked about, what is the HR person? Where are they looking? I'm going to say, has that HR person been given a target? Right? Because as long as you're chasing the target, you're just trying to check a box. Checking the box isn't going to get it done, right? And Nick raised a very key point when he talks about embracing our ignorance. we all have biases. I conduct a lot of trainings for C-suite, frontline workers, as well as HR personnel. And I usually show images. I ask the question, I say, who here eats the same exact meal every single day? Raise your hand. Most people don't raise their hand. Who here wears the same clothes? I mean, the same thing every single day. Raise your hand. No one raises their hand, probably for fear of shame, but no one raises their hand. Who listens to the same song every single day? Same song, raise your hand. No one raises their hand. So I say, you like diversity in your cuisine. You like diversity in your clothing. You like diversity in your music, but yet you say you struggle with diversity? The reality is we don't struggle with diversity. Most of us, look, it was Tuesday yesterday. How many people had Taco Tuesday yesterday? People would probably raise their hand. And you ask the question, how many of you are actually Latin? How many of you part of the Latinx community? Very few people would raise their hand. I think Trevor Noah had this skit where he says, Americans love tacos. Now it's interesting, right? Because we say we struggle with inclusivity, we struggle with equity, but yet we take what we want. And that's the beauty, but it's also the challenge of American culture. The beauty of American culture is that we have aspirationally said, give me your poor, give me your right. We set that aspirationally. That's what we want. Nick mentioned the Reconstruction period and era. You look at every marginalized community and group in this country, and those advances are directly tied to the 14th Amendment. Why was the 14th Amendment passed? It was passed to address the inequities experienced by slaves. Every ethnic group you have has, every marginalized group you have has the rights that they have on the backs of freed slaves and of Black people in this country. It's a unique experience. Women were quieted, but they were not enslaved. Asians, and we know that they are going through a significant amount of xenophobia and everything else going on right now. And so we stand with those in our Asian community. They were mistreated and extradited, but they were not enslaved. The Latinx community has for years been pilfered for their labor and then exported back across the border, right, when it's convenient for this country, but they were not enslaved. Native Americans were slaughtered. Nick talked about President Andrew Johnson and his actions and what he took, what he did in terms of actual legislation, but they were not enslaved. I think the misnomer is that in this country, we believe that the oppression to the freed slaves, to African Americans, ended when slavery ended. But that's not history. That's not actual. That's not factual. That's not our history. And I'm not going to go through each iteration of how that has continued throughout the years. But if we thought it was over, if we thought that just getting through 2020 would liberate us from this, you only have to look at January 6th. And Nick said something that's very key. The democracy that we so freely take for granted is a very fragile concept that can easily be lost. Let me put January 6th into context. This is not a political speech, but this is just factual. Prior to January 6th, the Confederate flag had not been paraded or flown in this nation's capital. Even during the Civil War, even during the years after it, that flag had not made it to this nation's capital. Yet on January 6th, 2021, that flag that literally represents soldiers that fought against the American flag was paraded down the halls of this nation's capital. If that doesn't shape and redirect the lens through which you look at, as it relates to this democracy, this democratic republic of the United States of America, I don't really know what will. It reminds me of the works of James Baldwin. James Baldwin said, to Nick's point about generations and the decisions that we're able to make, we're confronted with the opportunity to decide whether we push through the pain, push through the fatigue of the reality of where we are as a society. Do we push past that? Is it uncomfortable? Absolutely. Do we push past it? Is it easy? Absolutely not. Do we push past it, right? Is this utopia, is the attainment of this aspirational vision the forefathers had in creating the Constitution of this United States, is it worth the sacrifice to preserve and to attain to, or do we begin again? Nick mentioned in snapshot, I'm going to cover really quickly, Reconstruction, had period, but then we reverted back. Black laws, Jim Crow, right? Civil rights movement, then we reverted back. All the way up, diversity initiatives, then we reverted back. 2020 and 2021 has brought us to this point. Do we grow? Do we become, do we evolve to attain the aspirational goals that have been set out in the Constitution? Or do we begin again? Do we go back to square one and build up to this point again?
Okay. I have time? We have time for one more question?
Yes, we have time for one more. And before we do that, again, thank you guys so much. If you have any questions, any attendees have any questions, please go ahead. Now is the perfect time to start putting them in the chat. But yeah, we have time for one more question.
Yeah. And then I wanted to say just a couple of things that I was going to be saying in my introduction about our two speakers today. But so I just wanted to ask about, I think JT, you talked about the Mansfield rule, and I was doing a little research on the Rooney rule, which is in the NFL, because I teach strategy. So right, we want to do the analysis, we want to formulate a strategy, and then the question is, can we implement it? And there's mixed reviews on that Rooney rule, but one of the things I saw in there is they said, well, we're not going, teams want to win in the NFL, so they're not going to hire an unqualified coach, right? And so they said, okay, if you want to have more minorities in coaching, you've got to get more in the pipeline that are doing assistant coaching jobs at the college level and everything like that. So if you can relate that to, okay, what's Mansfield and Rooney, is there practical things that law firms or other business organizations can do to get more people into the pipeline so there can be more minority hiring? So JT, I'll let you start.
Sure. So I'm going to take the practical approach to things. It ties back into the word I have with intentionality. If you are in STEM and you want more diverse representation within the industry, and you look and you say, well, there aren't many women, and there aren't many racially ethnic minorities. When you start talking to certain segments, it's still predominantly majority, but then outside of that, you probably have a significant amount of Asians within that particular industry, right? But do you have Latinx community? Do you have, other BIPOC peoples? No. Well, then what is your step then to get more, right? We're talking about a societal issue, and that's something that we noted. It's not just within this industry. African Americans, Black people make up an estimated 14% of the nation's population. Do you have 14% represented in STEM? Do you have 14% represented in law? Do you have right? You don't. So the question is, why? Well, there must be an issue within society, within the pipeline. And so how do I address that issue? Well, you invest in the pipeline. Right? How do I invest in a pipeline? If I want more minorities interested in STEM, well, then I probably need to make a concerted effort to tap into those markets earlier to develop candidates. We can go off on a tangent and how we define qualified. We had a conversation about that. I think that is a key component to figure out, how do you define qualified? I'll give a practical example. I was having a conversation when I was being recruited to join a firm, and I was told by the managing partner of that firm that, JT, we'd love to hire more diverse candidates. We just note that, we just have difficulty finding qualified candidates. And I said, well, let me ask you, how do you define qualified? He said, well, the top 5 top 10% of their law class. It's okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. I said, can I push back a little bit? And he said, yeah, sure. I said, well, let me ask you a question. How many of the lawyers you currently have at your firm are in the top 5 and 10% of their class? And he paused and he looked at me, and I can tell he was processing. And I said, so what you're subliminally messaging is that the top 5, 10% diverse, racially ethnic minority lawyer is the equivalent of your mediocre majority lawyer. You haven't said it, you haven't verbalized it, but that's what your actions say. And so there needs to be that again, we talk about that, taking that analysis, taking that inventory and confronting where you are, right? How am I defining qualified? Make no mistakes about it. Nick and I attended the same law schools as our counterparts did, our non-minority counterparts did. We took the same exams that they did. We sat for the same bar exam that they did. So if we passed the very same tests that others did, why is there a question about our ability and not theirs? And so it's important that you confront that reality, confront that, ask yourself that question, and then figure out how to move on. So in a practical sense, intentional investment in the pipeline within institutions, educational institutions, within extracurricular programming. Just the Beginning Foundation is a program that operates here in the city and in other places that focuses on introducing elementary school and high school students to the law. We now have charter schools in the city of Chicago. We got legal prep, which actually focuses a curriculum more geared towards getting students interested in the legal profession. You have various institutions. There's one that I know a couple of buddies operate out of UIC that focuses on STEM. And so it's that intentional investment into the development of the pipeline, which makes that career field a reality. When you talk about children in underserved communities, you can say you can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, you can be these things. But if they don't have that visual, if they don't see it, if it's not there as a realistic opportunity, a realistic pathway for them, then it doesn't make sense. And we can dovetail into a completely different conversation about the overrepresentation of BIPOC peoples within the criminal system, within low wage positions, and how that ties directly into some of the legislative and statutory inequities that Nick and I briefly touched upon when we talked about the post-slavery measures taken in this country. It's looking at those issues and choosing to make a different choice and to employ a different strategy to address the issue.
Okay, Nick, just a couple minutes, and I think we're going to open it for questions.
Yeah, I think JT touched on it perfectly. I'm going to take a slightly different approach and push back on the idea that there's a pipeline problem. To a certain extent, there is, because the numbers aren't there heading from the high schools to the colleges to the law schools, engineering schools, medical schools, et cetera. I think, I addressed that a little bit earlier. That said, I don't believe there is a pipeline problem for most companies to be hiring Black, brown, BIPOC people. I think the question is exactly what JT discussed earlier, is how they are defining the term qualified. Because when we're talking about diversity initiatives, diversity and inclusion initiatives, that term qualified is always thrown about. And one of my law partners, Steve Pugh, he said is a very well-respected and Black lawyer in the city of Chicago, been practicing a long time, hates the term, flips out at the term. And the reason is, he said, every time we're talking about minority or diversity issues, we're talking about qualified. Why is that? Like, yeah, they're qualified. Like, that's the baseline. There's no discussion other than that. Of course, they're going to be qualified. Nobody's asking for anything less. If there was someone unqualified, they wouldn't make it in the door. So I think to that point, to tie this into Mansfield and the Rooney Rule, is people are being overlooked. They're providing opportunities. I'll answer this in 3 different ways. On the one hand, they're providing opportunities to retreads who've been around forever, who happen to be their friends. On the other hand, they are creating a higher requirement for Black and brown populations to fit the mold than they are for the majority. And on the third hand, they're ignoring people who are prepared to make that move. Briefly touch on one. You see behind me, my beloved White Sox. Instead of looking at many of the young minority managerial candidates, my beloved White Sox went to a 75-year-old retread who retired 10 plus years ago to manage a team full of young, diverse players who have, strongly spoken up and spoken out against discrimination, who are some of the most exciting players, but they brought in the old guy without interviewing anyone else. Then you look at the NFL and you see talented, high-level assistant coaches who have won Super Bowl championships, who have trained elite athletes, and they're overlooked. So now it's like, okay, you said I had to be at a high level, but I'm not getting the job. You said I had to be able to work well with others, but I'm not getting the job. You said I have to have this high level skill, but I'm not getting the job. Why am I not getting the job? So to your point, Professor Miller, I think there is a pipeline issue from a macro perspective, but a micro perspective, there's really not. What's happening is businesses are intentionally deciding to go with the employees who they've always been comfortable with. And that is what we have to break out of. That is what we have to understand, that there is a benefit to bringing in diverse and inclusive environments, training these people up. And one final point, I know we have to end this, but one final point, and we can't forget this. When you're going out and you're spending that money and you're hiring that talented accountant, lawyer, doctor, engineer, whatever, you can't just leave that person without, providing that person without capable work, without training that person. Because at that point, what you're doing is you're bringing in people to flounder. And then eventually they're not going to stay and they're going to go elsewhere. You spent the time, the money, the effort, the energy to bring in an individual to presumably help your organization. We'll provide that individual with the substantive work, train that individual up to make sure they're going to stick around and do greater work and have a greater opportunity for you.
Yeah, and I think that's the inclusion part. And I think a lot what we're talking about there is implicit bias, right? Of
Yes.
Looking in the mirror and just trying to say, okay, you're not even conscious of this, but and I think JT gave that example to the person he was talking about at his law firm. Okay, before we start questions, I just want to ask a couple of quick questions that I was going to. One, some of my students are here, and I get people asking, okay, should I be a lawyer? Okay, so maybe you could just take a minute of why did you decide to be a lawyer? JT?
So in full candor, no judgment, twofold. First, my third grade teacher, I would challenge her daily on homework. And my argument was, if we've been in school all day and we've been covering these lessons all day, why do I have to go home with homework? I felt that we should reevaluate the system. And as she said, you make a good lawyer one day. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of why I chose to practice law is the conversation that we're having right now. To look at these issues and to really see how and where we are, and then to see and chart a pathway for where we actually could be. We as a society, we are a society of laws. To your point, whenever someone asks and questions me about practicing law, I pause and I say, take a look around the room that you're in. A lawyer had something to do with everything you see in this room. We are a society of laws. And so my thought was, if we are a society of laws and of laws govern and impact so much of what we do on a daily basis, what if we use the law to actually create the environment that we say we desire? What if the law was, and you look at it, you look at the civil rights movement, you talk about Thurgood Marshall, you look at innovation and technology, you talk about lawyers in the IP, patent and trademark industry. And so lawyers are at the very forefront. You heard me say this earlier. Lawyers are at the very forefront of innovation and of our society, moving our society forward in so many ways. That attracted me to be a part of that movement, to say, this is who we are, but imagine who we could be. And that's why I chose the law.
Okay. Nick?
I'm going to keep it a lot shorter.
Okay.
I'm not nearly as deep as JT. I want to be a trial attorney. I want to be on my feet. I want to argue cases in front of a jury. And that is ultimately what I had what I've had the opportunity to do. It's been a true blessing.
Okay. And then did you two know each other at UIC when you were students?
Yes.
Yeah, you did. Okay. And then the final thing I just want to mention, if you haven't, I would go online and search these two out, because I did. And they have a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, and it shows you how engaged they are in their communities. Because like I think Nick has a couple of recorded podcasts about various issues in the community. And
Yes.
then JT, okay, so you're thinking about being a lawyer. He's got this great video online where he argued this mock product liability case at the Trial Academy in California, which I think would be very interesting to see. And he's written some very interesting articles. I didn't get a chance to talk to you about it, but this one, Unmasked, where he's talking about the hope of the future generations, changing and tilting our view, or maybe getting closer to, living out what the American creed is. So yeah, I would definitely say you read that. It's a very insightful article, which I think you just wrote in February. So it's very good. So, hey, thanks a lot, guys. It was really great. Let's open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you guys
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you again. This has been some really great discussions. Really quickly, before I ask the first question, I'm going to put up a quick poll. Before everyone logs off, if you can go ahead and take it. And as I launch this poll, I will ask Nick and JT the first question that we got in, which was, and I think you guys may have touched on this a little bit in some of your earlier discussions, but what role do you see for the teachers' unions to play in changing primary education to encourage increasing STEM and other overlooked disciplines for minorities?
I think they play a critical role. I think teachers, the same as what JT said, that a third grade teacher motivated him in some way to become a lawyer. One of my teachers in high school taught a law class, and when I was a junior or senior, and that motivated me. I think teachers play a significant role. And I think we have to move beyond this concept that Black students and brown students are disposable, that the only thing they can do is work with their hands, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with, or play a sport, which there's nothing wrong with. But we need to be doing more to engage all students. So I don't think it's just the teachers' unions. I think it's individual teachers, it's community members, it's priests, it's pastors, to say, look, this kid over here has a glow. I'm going to expose him. I mean, I have two kids, two boys, 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, and we throw them into everything that we can. Obviously, we have, the economic opportunity to do so. So I'm not prejudging anyone else, but there are lots of free programs run by the Park District, run by CPS, run by community organizations, the YMCA, et cetera, to expose children. It's exposure. Be there for them. We need to work as a community to assist and grow.
I echo Nick's sentiments that I think teachers as a whole, the education system as a whole plays a pivotal role. But I think it's important, as we talked about these issues through the lens of HR personnel, it's important for educators to view their approach to education and the curriculum in which they're teaching through a similar lens, right? If I would elevate for this audience is the works of Jane Elliott and how she approached and said, listen, if you are educated in the American public school system, you have some ingrained biases in you. And I think it's important to really take a look at that, right? How it plays out. I'm not going to go into it right now because that will take us on a very long other conversation. And I want to be cognizant of other people's times, but we can talk about it offline if you like. But I would just look into Jane Elliott and look into some of her works and other scholarship on the issue of the manner in which we educate in this country. I too, like Nick, have 2 children. I have 2 daughters. My daughters are actually older. One is 23 and one is actually 21 today. So it's her 21st birthday. So we're celebrating her birthday today. But I took the approach that I was the primary educator to my children. The school system merely supplemented what I did. And so they had homework from me. And my daughters went to some of the best schools the state have to offer. Both graduated from Lane Tech. They attended Pritzker Elementary School as elementary. And one questioned me at dinner one day, and she said, Dad, I feel like most of the curriculum asks me to take in information and simply regurgitate it. It doesn't really ask me to think. And I said, now you go to one of the best schools this state has to offer. And that's the experience that you just expressed. Now you know why I give you more work. And can you imagine a student that does not have the opportunity to attend a selective enrollment school, right? If that's your analysis, if that's your critique, what do you think the child at Marshall, at the old Crane, what do you think their experience might be, right? And so it's really looking at how we have historically approached education and really looking at it through a fresh and new lens.
Great, thank you so much. Another good one, and this might be better to, well, 2 things. One, Nick and JT, is it okay if I go ahead and put your LinkedIn's in the chat? So if
Yes.
anyone wants to connect and message and have offline conversations,
Yes.
they can reach out to you guys on LinkedIn. Awesome. And then, so this question, again, might be a good, potentially offline question. Can you point to any specific firms or organizations, even nonprofit, universities, et cetera, that we can look to as models for diversity and inclusion?
Yes, I'll give you one in the legal space. There's one called LCLD, Legal Council on Legal Diversity, which really focuses and targets increasing diversity, equity, and advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion within the legal space. It's a cohort, it's a collaborative effort between law firms and actual corporations. So the conversation I talked about yesterday occurred yesterday with Dev Stalkoff of Microsoft was as a part of that organization. And so it employs a strategic method of actually developing and advancing diverse attorneys. And there are a number of other programs. I know my friends at Google and at Microsoft and at Facebook and at some of the other companies have really began to invest strategically in HBCUs and developing programs, internships, and the like for what Nick and I were talking about with the pipeline. I really call it access to opportunity, because it's not really a pipeline issue. It's access to those opportunities, creating clearer pathways for individuals in marginalized communities to access some of those environments that have historically been underrepresented.
Awesome, thank you. And then I kind of want to get to this one because it's a more in-depth one, and we may potentially probably close on this one, but I think it's good and kind of sums up a lot of what we talked about today. So the question is, Where does the line fall between an organization's obligation to provide an inclusive environment and an individual's responsibility to, one, select a company whose values are aligned with theirs, and two, somehow communicate what influences their sense of inclusion? They also added that the root of this question is, if a company is proactively taking action to build an inclusive culture, how do they know what to do to cast the widest net? Because since you cannot please all people all the time. So kind of a bigger question, but I think a good one to maybe close out on, if that's okay.
I actually think that's a great point. And to number two, I'm actually working on a commencement address right now. So when I log off of this, I'll have to work on drafting that. And that's actually one of my points. You do have your own obligations, just the same way as you can't expect for those who are religious, the church to save you. You've got to invest in your own religious beliefs, whatever that may be. You have to train yourself. The same as to JT's point. You can't expect the schools to teach your kids. You have to be the primary trainer. In this instance, you can't expect the company to bring that inclusivity to you if they don't know. You got to open your mouth. And I taught at UIC for 12 years between 2005 and 2012. And what I saw is, it was my first time being around a large group of millennials, and at the very tail end, Gen Z. And it was an interesting environment, that being that a lot of folks didn't open their mouth. Like they didn't tell you what they felt. And I think a lot of that they're then kind of funneling out of the schools and into the workplace. And now they're upset at what's happening. So for those of you who hear my voice, there's an issue. You've got to open your mouth. If you feel that you're not getting that work, if you feel that you're being marginalized, if you feel that there's something escaping you, then you've got to speak to that point, because it is very possible that the individual who you're working for or working with or reporting to does not know. There may not be an individual there who is intentionally trying to subjugate you, but they're just ignorant. And it's, once again, to our point earlier, embrace the ignorance. Try to evaluate that. I've worked with that my entire career, talking to people I work with, my partners, to express what my beliefs are and to explain that to them. Now, after you explain those issues, if they're still not willing to adjust their thought processes or to work with you for whatever the issue is, then I think it goes to number one. Maybe you need to be selecting a company whose values are more aligned with your own. I think that is slightly different than the topic that we started this conversation with, but I think it's apropos that every individual has an obligation to take care of and embrace their own responsibilities as to how they're going to grow and enhance in their own business lives.
Yeah. So to tackle that, 2 point, an individual's responsibility, one, to select a company, right, whose values are aligned with theirs. I think that's a very key component when looking at which firms to join. I've been at Dinsmore. It'll be 2 years in 2009. It's been 2 years, a little over 2 years. I joined January 2019. One of the main elements that I had was, what is the firm's stance and what is the firm's presence within the DE&I space? Not just aspirational. What is the firm doing? And I had opportunities to go to a number of firms. Dinsmore was showing and trending. Let me be very clear. There's no perfect environment because we ourselves are imperfect, but they were on track. They were heading in the direction that I thought made the most sense in this space. I mentioned the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer positions that were created. They were created pre-George Floyd. They were created in 2019. So before the awakening occurred, Dinsmore saw for the future, this is something we need to do, right? That is one of the reasons why I selected this particular firm. So I do believe that individual responsibility is present, because I think we frequently try to shirk back and say, well, society is just a macro manifestation of micro level positions. Society doesn't exist outside of the individuals that comprise the society. And so it's our individual responsibility that plays out in this space. And so to Nick's point about, so it does take individual agency to you yourself model, pursue, and advance inclusivity. And then to the second part of that is, how do you communicate that? I pause. It's already been communicated. The reason why I'm going to speak very frankly about the legal profession, at the end of 2019, so beginning of 2020, before George Floyd, the legal profession, law partners in large law firms, there were less than 2% were Black. When you talk about Black women, those who identify as Black women, less than 1%. What you see, and this is tying into the business case for diversity, people will vote and communicate their frustration with their feet. When you see high turnover in your workplace, in your staff, in your workforce, they're communicating to you, this is not the place that I can identify with. So how do you as an individual create a space that is more inclusive? Let me give you an anecdote that's a personal example of when I expressed my own bias and my own ignorance. One of the members of my team member is a Korean woman. And it was coming up on New Year. And I said, hey, do you celebrate Chinese New Year? And she paused. She said, JT, more than China celebrates this New Year. Actually, Korea and many of the Asian companies, except Japan, not Japan, but many of the other Asian countries celebrate this year. We call it Lunar New Year. Pause. I'm from the west side of Chicago. I've only ever heard it referred to as Chinese New Year. I think most Americans, because when I even Googled Lunar New Year, it kept saying Chinese New Year. It's not Chinese New Year, it's Lunar New Year. But let's pause. When she spoke that, I had the opportunity to either rebuff her and continue in my ignorance, or receive what she said, make the adjustment, and grow from it. I chose to grow. But let's talk about from her perspective, because that's me, right? That's me acknowledging my ignorance and me choosing to grow. But let's flip it and look at through her perspective. How comfortable must she have been to speak her truth to the person who manages her? So that is how you know that there's an environment, at least of some level of inclusivity, because she felt empowered to speak her truth, not to just nod her head, smile, and go along with it. No, she said, JT, it's Lunar New Year. Great, right? Now this year, so that was in 2019. This year, I bought lunch for the entire team to celebrate Lunar New Year, for those who celebrate Lunar New Year. So that's when we talk about being inclusive. It's about making people feel comfortable and welcomed in their space, not trying to make them conform to you and how you operate, but accepting and receiving them as they are. We all have ignorance. We all have bias, to Nick's point. It's our willingness to confront that ignorance, confront that bias, and create a space where people can be their authentic selves.
Yeah, that was a great example. Before we end this, I did want to read something that I was going to do at the beginning. One of this thing was about human resource management. So I just wanted to give you, the human resource management began in fall of 2019 at UIC. There's 58 UIC students in it. Diversity is incorporated in several of the HR courses. The HR degree at UIC is aligned with the Society for Human Resource Management, SHARM. Our students can sit for a SHARM exam that gives them a SHARM certification, which is different than other universities. And I think, the point that you guys are making is that maybe human resource managers really have to be change agents, that they have to come in there with not the, because it is, I think that's, from the whole discussion here, what I think, what I have to analyze in my own life is this implied bias, implicit bias that so many of us have. And analyze. And I think that's the same thing in human resource management. Like you said, okay, how do we define qualified? Can we maybe think in a different realm than we traditionally have? And what I teach in my class is a lot about change management, right? I tell my students, the only thing I can guarantee you are things that are going to change. And then you have to be part of that change agent. So thank you very much, guys. That was great. Hopefully the audience, picked up on all the points that we made today. But thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes. Thank you guys
Thank
so
you very
much. Yeah, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Nick and JT. Again, you guys are amazing. And Professor Miller, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, sorry I was late. Couldn't-
It's okay. It's okay.
I got it. I
worked
was
out.
glad. No, because I had prepared for this. It was my big data, and I think it's an important discussion.
Oh,
And,
it worked out beautifully. So
yeah,
thank you.
so-
Thank you guys again. Be on the lookout for this recording to be on business.uic.edu in about a week or two. If you have any questions or follow up for Nick and JT, I put their LinkedIn in the chat. So you can always also follow up with me, Michaela Smith Espel. And my information is also on the business.uic.edu website. Again, thank you guys. This was amazing and informative. And I just really appreciate, especially Nick and JT. Thank you for taking the time out today. You guys are amazing. And this was incredible. And we are very thankful to have some amazing UIC alumni like you. So thank you.
Absolutely. Go UIC, go Flames. Thank you,
Go
Professor.
Flames. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes,
Take care.
go Flames. Thank you guys.
Thanks.
Everyone have a great day.
Right.
Be
Okay.
well. Stay
You
safe.
too.
Okay. Bye-bye.